All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is going to be lecture 5.2. So we are still in the first lesson of the Roaring Twenties. So please get out your notebook and remember to pick up where you left off from 5.1. Don't skip any lines, don't skip any pages. This is a continuation. All right, so we're talking about the Red Scare, the fear of communist influence inside the United States after World War I. And remember, it was largely caused because of the Russian Revolution, when Russia, in the middle of World War I, had the Bolsheviks, the communists, rise up under Vladimir Lenin and his right-hand man, Joseph Stalin. And they are going to eventually take control of Russia and make it into the Soviet Union by 1922. Well, in the United States, we saw that this led to an increased fear of anybody coming from Russia or places of Eastern Europe. This is nativism, when you discriminate against immigrants. And it led to things like the Palmer raids, where many thousands of Americans, some were immigrants, some American citizens, were rounded up under suspected communist or anarchist beliefs, held in detention facilities, and hundreds of them were deported back to where they came from. So that's the Palmer raids, and that was also the beginning of the FBI. The FBI will come out of the Palmer raids. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants that had lived in the Boston area for several years. And then when World War I began, they fled down to Mexico to avoid the drafts of the Selective Service Act. After the war, they came back and participated in many of the labor unrest and protests that were going around the country at the end of the war, as many soldiers came back and the situation got pretty riotous in the United States. They were noted anarchists. So remember, an anarchist is somebody who does not believe in the government at all. Like, they want no government. They want to tear down the institutions. They want to kind of reordering. They want to get rid of the government. So these guys are seen as radicals. They're extremists, especially during this Red Scare. And they were passing out and dumping some pamphlets about their anarchist activities when they were arrested for the murder of a guard at a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. Just a side note, Braintree, Massachusetts is also the birthplace of two presidents, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. Quincy, Massachusetts, Braintree, Massachusetts. So at this shoe factory, a guard was killed, and I think Vanzetti was supposed to be the getaway man, and Sacco maybe was the shooter or something. But none of the facts of this case really matter. Maybe they were trying to, along with their group that committed this robbery, maybe they were trying to get money for their anarchist activities and their protests and stuff. But the facts didn't matter because the Red Scare was so prevalent in society at this time that when they go to trial, the judge, the jury is very predisposed against them, very discriminating against them because they're immigrants and because of their leftist, radical, anarchist leanings. They really don't get a fair trial. None of the evidence is really looked at, and they end up getting sentenced to death. Not so much because it was convincing evidence, again, that proved that, Sacco had shot the guard or that Vanzetti had been part of that murder as well. Vanzetti probably wasn't. But none of that mattered because this was the Red Scare, and America's so paranoid and fearful about communist or anarchist or other radical ideas that we don't give these guys a fair trial, even though they should have. That's a right as an American. Remember, fair trial, that's Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth Amendment stuff is all dealing with your rights to a fair trial. And so they are convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair, which was the method of execution at this time. They go through a lengthy appeal process where their case gets tried in other courts. They try to get retrials, and every time they're denied. But over the years, from 1921, when they were first convicted of this crime, up until 1927, the more retrials and appeals that they have, the more people take notice of how unfair, how unjust America was being. And there's huge international protest against their execution. People in England and France, all around the world, were very upset at hearing that America was executing these guys, mostly just because they were immigrants and because they had some leftist views. Um, but it doesn't matter. The protests fall on deaf ears. And in 1927, both Sacco, there's Nicola Sacco, and there's Bartolomeo Vanzetti, both are executed. So their deaths are kind of indicative of this Red Scare in America. And remember, again, this is nativism. When you fear and discriminate against immigrants, that is nativism. And speaking of nativism, there is another group that is going to be discriminating against immigrants during this time and adding fuel to this fire that is the Red Scare, this fear and paranoia that's gripping our country, and that is the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK had first come about right after the Civil War. That was in like 1865 when the Civil War ended. I believe Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first Klansman in Tennessee there, formed the Klan in 1866. But by the 1870s, thanks to the Force Act under Ulysses S. Grant as president, the Klan had kind of gone back underground. They hadn't disappeared, obviously, and they took many other forms, during and after Reconstruction to suppress African Americans and make sure that their new 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights weren't being held. But they were kind of underground and again, very secretive organization with their own rules, and everybody has to have their faces hidden because they are vigilantes. They're not operating under the law. But they were mostly in the South and mostly had kind of been kind of quiet. Then in 1915, several things happened. World War I is ramping up, and America's wanting to keep out of that. So we're going to see an increase in nativism against immigrants that could be bringing over these radical, chaotic ideas. We're also going to see the release of a movie called The Birth of a Nation. It was black and white, like all the movies at this time. This is 1915. And also there was no sound. They had a musical score that played alongside the movie, but there was no, voice. There was no voicing in movies at this time. So it's a silent picture, black and white. But this movie was the first of its kind in many ways. A lot of the picture quality, the video work that was done was really new, and it was a full-length feature. And Woodrow Wilson, our president, actually screened it at the White House. And the topic of the movie, The Birth of a Nation, was about the Old South, the Confederacy. Remember the plantation-based slave-owning society of the South, and how basically they were unfairly persecuted by the North, and it's kind of like Gone with the Wind. Their way of life was unfairly taken away from them in the Civil War, and how the Klan, the KKK, were the heroes that came to redeem the South and basically help them out and save the Southern white people, and especially the poor Southern white women who were being unfairly attacked and everything. And the movie was so racist. It was so racist. Many of the actors in it, they were all white men who portrayed African Americans in caricatures and in very unflattering ways. They actually wore blackface, which is where you'd paint your face black to portray like an African American. And the movie was awful. It was basically showing the KKK as heroes, and it inspired a new generation of Klansmen basically. And like I said, President Wilson actually screened it. He watched it at the White House. It's terrible. So that is going on. World War I is going to add to this. The movie The Birth of a Nation is going to add to this. And there was also a Jewish factory store manager, a white man who's Jewish, immigrant that was lynched in Atlanta, Georgia in 1915 as well for allegedly attacking a young white woman. And so these things kind of led to this huge recruitment for the Klan in the 1920s. And we'll see their numbers absolutely swell. This picture in the bottom right here, this is the famous march, I believe it was 1925, when you had 50,000 Klansmen march right there in the nation's capital. You can see the Capitol Rotunda right there in the distance. They got very political. The Klan had helped to elect either directly or indirectly, like so many state officials, legislators, and so on. They had elected 10 Klansmen as governors around the country. And it wasn't just that the Klan was in the South anymore, like the original Klan after the Civil War. Now the Klan was, they're still in the South, but now they'd spread to the North. The Klan was really active in states like Indiana, which is in the North, and even in the West. They were nationwide. And their numbers got up to, I think, almost like 4 million Klansmen. Cat, no, don't, okay, sorry. She's a little crazy cat. Anyway, so yeah, their numbers got up to almost like 4 million. Now, as far as like the North, why was the North seeing this intense racism and nativism? Well, it's because World War I saw a big movement of people within our nation. This movement was called the Great Migration, especially for African Americans. Because there were new jobs that were coming about due to the war, these opportunities, like because you had so many white men going off to go fight in the Western Front over in Europe, new opportunities for factories in the North for African Americans opened up. And so many of them, they left the racist South where segregation, Jim Crow laws were the law of the land, and they went up to the North for new opportunities. And the North has typically been a place where, yes, there has been racism, but the segregation laws are de facto. They're not de jure. They're not by law. They're just by tradition. So it is a place where, as an African American, you would see more opportunities than you would like in the South. And for that reason, you see this big migration begin, where over the course of several decades, beginning with World War I and into the 1920s, millions of African Americans will move out of the South and into northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York City, and so on. And so part of the reason, again, why we see the Klan numbers surge in places outside the South at this time in the 1920s was because of that migration of African Americans into the North. But the Klan wasn't just going after and attacking African Americans, scaring them and lynching them and terrorizing. They were also doing this to immigrants, especially those who were coming from Eastern Europe, like Jewish immigrants, and also to Catholic immigrants, like those coming from Italy. They targeted Blacks, Jews, and Catholics especially during this time in the 1920s. And it led to major race riots. In the 1920s, you're going to see many cities throughout the entire country have giant riots taking place. Dozens of Blacks were killed during the 1917 riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, where employers had recruited Black workers in an attempt to weaken the unions, most of which had excluded Blacks from membership. In 1919, more than 250 African Americans died in riots in the urban North. Most notable was the violence in Chicago, touched off by the drowning of white bathers of a Black teenager who had accidentally crossed the unofficial dividing line between Black and white beaches on Lake Michigan. By the time the National Guard restored order there in Chicago, 38 people had been killed and more than 500 injured. Violence was not confined to the North either. In the year after the war ended, 76 persons were lynched in the South. And remember, lynchings aren't just hangings, they're murders done usually through racial motivation. including several returning Black veterans wearing their uniforms from World War I, Black soldiers who had fought for this country that treated them this way, who had survived the war, came back home, these heroes, and they were killed in the South wearing their uniforms. The worst race riot in American history occurred famously in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. This was the Black Wall Street, where you had many prominent African American businesses. When more than 300 Blacks were killed there and over 10,000 left homeless after a white mob, including police and National Guardsmen, burned an all-Black section of the city to the ground. So, yes, the 20s are not going to be a good time for those who were not white or not Protestant or not fitting into this image of what America was supposed to be. And the Klansmen, they are going after Blacks and Jews and Catholics. This is where you get the famous saying of the Klan that they are WASPs. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Anglo-Saxon means usually of like British descent, okay? And Protestant means the sort of Christianity that is not Catholic. It comes out of the Protestant Reformation from the 1500s, from like Martin Luther nailing those 95 complaints to the Catholic church doors. Protestant denominations are very common throughout the United States, like Baptist churches, Methodist churches, etc. So these are the sorts of people that would be in the Klan. However, please let me just say, just because you are white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant does not mean that you are part of the Klan. Believe it or not, but I actually had to tell some students that several years ago because they were like, oh, everybody who is this is part of the Klan. No. But everybody who is in the Klan are those things, if that makes sense. Okay. So this is something that is happening in the 1920s. And remember, I think we talked about earlier with the Ida B. Wells lecture, but as far as lynchings go in Texas, this was very dominant at the time. In 1915, that was when Jesse Washington was very brutally lynched in downtown Waco, Texas. So yeah. Going along with these ideas about how destructive and dangerous immigrants were, ideas of nativism in the 1920s being spurred on by the race riots and the labor riots and the labor strikes following World War I, we're going to see a number of immigration laws pass through Congress in the United States. The first was in 1921, but the big one is going to be in 1924. It's called the National Origins Act, and it is going to do a lot to restrict who can come over to the United States. Now, this law was specifically to target those immigrants that were coming from like the new immigrant places we talked about in the Gilded Age, particularly Eastern and Southern Europe, okay? The National Origins Act, this immigration restriction law from 1924, it would permanently limit those Eastern immigrants, especially, to just 150,000 to be able to come over per year, distributed according to a series of national quotas. A quota is a certain amount, a limit on something that severely restricted the numbers from these places, again, Southern and Eastern Europe. However, to satisfy the demands of large farmers in the Southwest, and especially California, who relied heavily on seasonal Mexican labor, the 1924 law established no limits on immigration from the Americas. So please keep in mind, this is not like the immigration we have today, the restrictions and the debates and all the new stuff we have today. This was about limiting Eastern, Southern European immigrants. It did not restrict immigrants coming from Latin America, like from Mexico, at all. The immigration did bar the entry of all those ineligible for naturalized citizenship, however. So this is like where we're talking about Asian people, because remember in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act had passed, and that was to keep Chinese people from immigrating into the United States, due particularly to competition for jobs on the West Coast, like in California. So that's going to be part of this, making it basically impossible, not just for Chinese people to come over, but for any Asian people, including Japanese, to come over as new immigrants, which is kind of ironic considering, you know, this was just after World War I, and Japan had actually fought with our side, the Allies' side, in the Great War. So this does, for the first time, create, I think it's interesting, a new category called the illegal alien. That's when we first start to hear that term. And with this term, the illegal alien, came new enforcement mechanisms such as the Border Patrol. This is when it was kind of first created here in the 1920s. They were charged with policing the land boundaries of the United States and empowered to arrest and deport persons who entered the country in violation of this new National Origins Act, or any of these quotas or other restrictions on immigration. A term later associated almost completely with you know, Latino immigrants, the term illegal alien. It's first again here referring mainly to Southern and Eastern Europeans who tried to sneak across the border from Mexico or Canada to get into the United States. So this is a time of intense nativism, discrimination against immigrants. And here is this cartoon kind of showing this. This is the National Origins Act, this funnel. And you can see in the funnel that there's all these, like it should say Eastern and Southern European immigrants who want to come into the United States, but we're only going to be allowing 3% from these selective countries to come in. Immigrants who wanted to come from like Northern or Western Europe, those won't see the restrictions as great. They'll be allowed to have a much larger number come in because, again, we're not discriminating against those Northern or Western Europeans as much as we are against the Eastern and Southern European immigrants who are bringing over radical ideas that we didn't like, such as communism, socialism, anarchism, ideas in new religions like Judaism and Catholicism. And again, these were different and they were scary and people didn't understand them and people feared what they don't understand. Whew, boy. Let's talk about eugenics. By the way, this first lesson is where we talk about all the scary things that were happening in America in the 1920s. 1920s were called the Roaring 20s, though, because there will be some you know, good things happening, some exciting things, roaring for the car engines of all the Model Ts. They'll be rolling off the assembly line. America starts driving, and you know, and it was really roaring for some people, but then it was roaring in a bad way for others. So let's talk about one of the really bad things that was happening, and that's eugenics. Eugenics is a pseudoscientific belief that the human race can be improved by selective breeding. Let's break that down. Pseudoscience is not real science. It is fake science that pretends to be real science. Understand that. And basically, eugenicists believe that you can make humans better by selectively breeding humans. So you know how like we breed racehorses to get faster racehorses. You breed, you know, beautiful golden retrievers to get even prettier, sweeter golden retrievers. You breed animals. That's been a practice for thousands of years. Animal husbandry and selective breeding of animals for specific traits. Well, eugenics does that with human beings, breeding a mother and a father together to have a child with specific traits. Now, this in itself is not an evil thing. Okay, bear that in mind. Like, if you are desiring somebody and you think you'll have beautiful children with them because you're both beautiful and smart and whatever, I mean, that's not a bad thing. That's perfectly fine. But when somebody tells you you can't have babies because you're a certain way, or saying that you can't have babies with another person because they're a certain way, that is where eugenics becomes very, very evil, very terrible. Okay, so this is what we mean by selective human breeding. And it is kind of influenced again with that old notion of social Darwinism. Yeah, the different human races competed for survival just like plants and animals. That was this idea that sprang out of the evolution theory from Charles Darwin. But this was instead applying it to societies as a whole, saying that some people were better than other people because of what they had. Like the robber barons, the captains of industry, these rich, wealthy, businessmen were more evolved than like a poor factory worker because they had made it rich. So that's social Darwinism. We're saying that, American people were better than like Puerto Rican people or Filipino people because we had trains and cars and highways and skyscrapers and they did not, things like that. So this belief that propagates nativism and racism, that also is being applied here to eugenics. And you will see, like, look on these pictures here, you will see eugenics and eugenicists very common throughout the 1920s, trying to actually, and these are progressives, trying to create a society which ascribes to their notions of what the perfect human being should be. So when it came to race, they want white people. They don't want black people able to have children and continue. They when it came to defects, if you were a person born with mental illness, they don't want people with any sort of mental or physical illnesses to be having children. So they start to have sterilization. You see right here, it says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. They're talking about people with mental illness. They're talking about poor people. They're saying these aren't the sorts of people that we want having children. And it was sold to the public, eugenics, this idea of selective human breeding, as a scientific principle, not as a theory or somebody's opinions, but as a scientific fact. They were selling this to people. So again, this is pseudoscience. This is fake science. It's not real science, but people bought into it. And it did lead to some actual laws in the United States that will affect a lot of people in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So marriage restrictions had already been pretty common in the South, but we'll see them throughout the nation at this time, especially restricting interracial marriages. Blacks and whites in many places throughout the country were not allowed to marry. We'll see also increased segregation laws. Like I said, Jim Crow laws throughout the South are those laws of segregation that kept blacks and whites separate. But you'll see many uh, middle states, such as like Kansas, start to have segregation as well. You'll see even northern states like Indiana and others start to have segregation. And in the North, even if it wasn't by law, it was called de facto, where they still had society segregated by where people could get homes and where people could work. That de facto is kind of traditional segregation. Well, whites are going to hang out here and blacks are going to hang out here. So segregation was still happening, was happening all around by law in the South, though, which was especially bad. And probably the worst thing that eugenics led to in the United States was the passage you can see in this map of the country, in many states, the passage of sterilization laws, or basically at asylums and institutions for the mentally ill, they would have forced sterilization surgeries where they would, like the way you would neuter or spay a dog or cat to keep them from having puppies and kittens. They did this to human beings, people in mental institutions who were not in control of all their faculties, or who maybe were going through something like schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder. People who were not in their right minds, they were forcibly sterilized. They had these operations done, basically removing their reproductive organs. And many of these people, later on, after they had recovered, found that they were not able to have children. That was literally taken away from them. And so that was part of this movement towards eugenics, this idea that we could breed a better society. Now, over in Europe, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they were big fans of what America was doing. Like over in California, they were having some of the most widespread sterilizations in the country. The Nazis will actually look to California. They'll look to the United States and what we were doing, and they will take it up a notch when it comes to like the Holocaust. Because I'm sure you've heard in the Holocaust, it wasn't just the gas chambers and the concentration camps. Nazi scientists also experimented on many of the Jewish inmates in these camps during the Holocaust, during World War II. And they did all sorts of eugenics experiments for human breeding and for other things, for certain traits, and did sterilizations and even just started basically wiping out people that they considered undesirables, the Jews, the gypsies, the mentally ill, the physically handicapped. They just started killing them by the time of the final solution in World War II. That was part of the Holocaust. And so we didn't get that bad over here, but we kind of gave them some ideas. That was eugenics. Oops. There we go. The Scopes monkey trial is a really big issue in the 1920s, so we're going to talk about that next time. We'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will definitely talk to you guys later. Bye.